Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of ZEISS Conversations. Have we got an awesome time for you? We've got a full house today, full of ZEISS ambassadors and ZEISS historians, and it's just going to be a great conversation today. So, without further ado, let me bring everybody into the channel so you can meet who our guests are today. We have an awesome group of people here. Along the top, you're going to see our ZEISS ambassadors. In the upper left corner is Greg Watermann. He's a rock and roll photographer. Many of you have seen him at a lot of our shows and some of our educational events and some of the other types of rock and roll events that we put on. He's going to be here and talk about his perspective on the lenses that he chooses, as well as Tracy Page taking the top center square there. She is a portrait photographer, going to talk about her lens perspectives. I bet you can see what the conversation is going to be about today. And then, of course, Professor Kenneth Hines in the upper right corner, our illustrious street photographer. And then in the bottom, new to everybody here and who's playing along at home, is our Senior Director of Cinema and Photo Lenses, Rich Schleuning. He's going to be here talking to us about, the lens perspectives, but maybe from not only as a shooter, but as from an engineering side as well. So, welcome to everybody. Glad
Thank
to have
you.
you here.
Hello.
Hey, Tony.
Hey.
So
So we kind of, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go right ahead. I was just going to say I'm going to turn it over to you guys to have a conversation.
And see, I wasn't even waiting for you to turn it over. I just was taking the mic immediately. So we kind of thought it would be a fun conversation. We're all so different. What we do is so different. We thought it would be a fun conversation to tell you a little bit about what we shoot with and what our perspective is, or what our point of view is, meaning why we shoot with that lens, and then let Rich take the conversation in a little different direction too, and give us some, some technical aspects of why these lenses do what they do for us. Because I know emotionally what I'm trying to achieve, but technically I don't always know how the lens is working, and he does. So hey, we're going to try not to really be, pass the mic round robin. We're going to have more of a discussion, but let's start with each of us telling everybody what lens we prefer and why. So Greg, why don't you start with that one?
Okay. My favorite focal length for what I do is a 35 millimeter lens. It's a great storytelling lens, reportage lens. It's a classic lens for focal length for that kind of work. To me, what I like is it gives me the feeling the most that I'm putting the viewer where I was whatever was going on that I was capturing, without adding any additional drama to it optically. A wide angle lens, I'll use a wide angle lens if I want things to be bigger, or I'll use a telephoto lens if I want to compress something or make the background disappear. But typically I want to show where I am and what's going on in the environment. I don't ever want to go wide though, because I'm almost always shooting people and don't want to have to deal with the distortion once people start getting to the edge of the frame. So the 35 millimeter lens is the best focal length for what I'm doing right now.
Ken, what are you shooting with? I know you've been changing it up on us a little bit.
Yeah, I mentioned this the last time that we were on, that I'm a little quirky, a little weird with my whole shooting style. And I've especially been changing up quite a bit lately. And ironically enough, I've actually been using the 21 millimeter Loxia lens. So a little bit different from what most people know me for, of using the autofocus Otus 85. And I originally was not sure if I could ever use a prime wide angle lens. I'm like, I just photograph in that range so often in the wide angle department that I'm like, I can't really be stuck to a fixed focal length. But then I got the 21 and I just have been hooked on it. And a lot lately with the 21, I've actually been shooting with my new camera, the A6400, the Sony A6400. So I've kind of been flipping between that with the crop sensor, which effectively gives me about 30, 35 millimeters. And then on the full frame to get the actual 21. And I've just have grown so attached to it. I don't know what it is about it, but the Loxia lenses, how they reproduce images, has just been so attractive to me that I've favored the Loxia over my traditional Otus lenses if I don't necessarily need the autofocus. So it's kind of ranged from, either I use it for street, architecture, just used it a couple of days ago for my waterfall images, my landscapes. So it's been a wide variety that I've used this lens for.
It's been kind of fun watching you change too. Ken was really known for a long time for shooting with his 85. So watching him change to a wider focal length has been a lot of fun. I think it's really, we keep using that word perspective, but it's really changed your perspective on what you're doing. And I'm enjoying watching the fresh ideas coming out of you with what you're doing. And then me, of course, I shoot with an Otus 100, and this is on my camera probably more than 95% of the time, rarely comes off of my camera. So I am new to Sony. I have always shot with my Nikon D850, and I'm changing over to a Sony Alpha. I'm going to get this wrong. R7 IV. No, I think I actually got it right. Or 7R4. Okay, close enough. And I'm using a Sigma MC11 adapter so that I can still use the Otus the way that I'm accustomed to using it on my Nikon. And for me, it's about dynamic range. The dynamic range is so incredible with this lens and with these particular cameras that I love to do a lot of black and white, and I can capture this really incredible dynamic range. And there's this really wonderful fall off from sharp to not sharp. So there's this really gentle change in the focus area from the sharp to the not sharp that I've never experienced with another lens. So I'm a big 100 fan. So somebody else take this and run with it.
Yeah, I was going to say, and then of course, Rich, you've been shooting ZEISS for forever, for years, even going back. What focal lengths do you find yourself gravitating towards most often?
35, just like Greg. Yeah, that's my go-to lens. In particular, 35-1.4. So it's I like this playing with the shallow depth of field. I mean, the focus fall off on that lens is really pretty. In particular, the classic 35-1.4 before the Milvus, and like Tracy, I adapted to whatever Sony body I have on hand. The Mark III lately has been the go-to. So either the Metabones or a Sigma adapter with a 35-1.4. It's really just a lovely combination. And if I don't have access to the 35, the 25-1.4. For the kind of
Rich,
stuff I do.
I never would have thought about adapting to a Sony until you mentioned to me that whole process, and you talked about how the Sony, the focus peaking would be so much easier to find my focus. I would not have done that. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, when I was shooting DSLR, I mean, one of the challenges we have with our Milvus and Classic line is that they're manual focus lenses, and that's due in part to licensing permission. So on these DSLR cameras, we don't have permission for autofocus. And manual focus, when you're using an optical viewfinder, sometimes that viewfinder isn't aligned with the sensor position. Back in the film days, it had to be, because the focusing screen actually was used to focus, not just compose. Nowadays, on an autofocus camera, it's a composition screen, right? Because the focusing is done, it bypasses the optical viewfinder. So if that piece of optical glass in the camera isn't aligned perfectly with the sensor position, it could look sharp through the viewfinder, but then when you pixel peep, you've missed your focus. So I was going with basically just select, just changing focus and doing a burst where I'd focus before and after the subject, and then edit the right one I need. Moving to a mirrorless system with the focusing aids, every shot's in focus. I mean, between a magnified viewfinder and focus peaking, you don't miss a shot.
That wasn't true for me when I was trying to adapt the Nikon mount to the Sony mount. But now that I'm adapting the Canon mount with the Sigma MC11, that seems to be really true for me. So is that why it was that pixel peeping that alignment that wasn't happening?
Could be. Yeah. Yep.
Now, I find it very interesting, hearing all of you mention what you're using. It's very ironic that I was the only autofocus person out of the bunch, and now I have kind of gone to the manual. Because when I met Greg 3 years ago for the first time, he was still shooting manual. So, like for you, Greg, like what kind of has shifted? You've gone through a lot in your career, and using the Otus lenses has kind of been a little bit of a switch for you from what I've known of your work and what you do. Is there something in particular as far as the different lenses that sold you in going to an autofocus lens, or was it just going to the Otus lenses and specifically, but was it something in terms of the look that you were getting that drove you to switching from the manual over to the autofocus?
No, I was just taking advantage of technology. I only switched to autofocus once autofocus got to be better than I was. I mean, when it was the Sony A9 specifically, I was already using the Otus lenses because they're ZEISS lenses. They looked good at that time, especially in the beginning of the Sony A7 bodies that were coming out. There weren't a lot of lens choices. The Otus lenses, the 85 and the 25, those were the first two that came out. Both amazing focal lengths that I like using. So I was using those from day one and mixing those with my classic lenses that I was still using with adapters, etc. But then when the Sony A9 came out in 2017, the autofocus system on that with face detect and then eye detect after that is so good that it all of a sudden made a whole other part of the Otus lenses that I wasn't even using, not only relevant, but like I said, better than I was. And it got to the point where I just very quickly switched from being a manual focus shooter to an autofocus shooter so that I could take advantage of those specific new technology advances. But the cool thing is that my pictures look the same as they've been looking for 30 years because they're still ZEISS lenses.
And I know both you and Tracy were, Milvus shooters, then you shot the Otus lenses also. Rich, as far as for people that might not be familiar with the Canon and Nikon mounted lenses of ZEISS, what are the differences that people get specifically with the classic as opposed to the Milvus? What's the difference between those two lines?
Okay, so when we had the classic lenses started to come out in 2007, initially for the Nikon mount. Canon mount was added in 2008, and then the range of lenses grew from 15 up to 135. I think that back in 2014, maybe late 2013, when they started to work on the next generation of the classic lenses, ultimately they became called the Milvus. There was several, I think, objectives. One of them is to make the lenses weather sealed, which the classic lenses were not. Some of it was to improve optical performance in some of the lenses, particularly at wide open aperture. So like the 50 1.4, the 85 1.4, 35 1.4, these were improved. So I would say 5 of the focal lengths, they came up with brand new optical designs. The 25 1.4 was brand new from the ground up. The 18 2.8 became a new lens, replaced the 18 f3.5. So it was a part mechanical changes. I know that they wanted to increase the focus rotation for video because the use of our lenses for motion capture was becoming more and more important. So they wanted more focus control with a longer throw. So that was really the design goals, moving from classic to Milvus.
Okay, awesome. It's as far as someone that might be looking into those lenses, it's there, outside of course, cost, I'm sure, because the Milvus, I would assume, is a little bit more pricier than what you have in the classic, being that they're weather sealed lenses and some are kind of upgrades to what was in the classic.
Yeah, but one of the great things about the Milvus line of lenses is that it's still on the same price point as a Nikon lens, a Nikkor, or a Canon. So it's, it's maybe more expensive than the Otus, but it's not a huge price difference. It's still pretty reasonable. And when you look at the comparison charts, I know this was one of the first things that Rich shared with me when I came on board, is the comparison between the Milvus and the Otus. Even in a lot of aspects, they're very neck on neck. The Milvus is every bit as sharp, if not sharper, and there's very little chromatic aberration or edge to edge distortion. So for the price point, it's just an incredible product.
Yeah, they run on price between like 1,200 to about 2,700, depending on the focal length. We didn't take, the price difference between the Milvus and the classic. In many cases, hadn't changed. If it was a new optical design, like the 35 1.4 and the 25 1.4, they're a little bit higher than the classic version.
Awesome. Go for it, Tracy. I think you're gonna.
Well, Greg, you mentioned the 35, but I see you shooting a lot with the 40. So what's the difference in between the 35 and the 40?
Availability.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, I'm actually quite fond already of the 40 millimeter focal length. The difference between 35 and 40, you wouldn't think you would necessarily notice, but maybe that I was concerned at first when I got it that every time I at first looked through the camera that I was always going to be taking a step back, but I never really felt like it was any tighter than it was. But I will say this, that it's a more, I prefer it more for portraits because it's just a more flattering, it's closer to a 50 than a 35. 35 really doesn't have a lot of curvature and distortion unless you have something right in the center of the frame and very close to it. Then it's going to start a little bit to make things not look the way that they are, but for the most part, it's still a relatively flat lens. So when the 40 came out, you know, they were just trying to come out with another focal length, give people another option, another choice. I gravitated toward it immediately, and like what you said about the Otus 100, it's on my camera 90% of the time. I could do everything that I need to do with that lens. I've shot entire jobs with that focal length only and not needed anything else. The group shot, A System of a Down, the shot of Chris and Drake, and hang on, and a picture of Travolta. This pit. Those are all. Are you posting those? Are they going up? Oh, okay.
We've got this secret little camera set up so that we can see what Tony's posting behind the scenes,
Yeah.
because sometimes
Which
there's a little bit of a lag.
about?
Yeah, we're like, what are you posting?
Okay, yeah. This, by the way, is not really a photograph. That's just a still frame from my 4K video footage. That's how good that is now in photography, so that you really can make pictures from video footage. Um, anyway, and all of these pictures, they're all 40 millimeter. What I like about them is, you know, at maybe just like one stop down, there's still an isolating factor going on that makes the person separate somewhat from the background. You know, again, it's a little bit of that ZEISS look, that ZEISS pop. I tend to like to shoot my lenses like either 1 to 2 stops down generally. I'll shoot them wide open if I need that extra drama and separation, especially if I'm closer to something. But most of the time I need a little bit of focus, like both eyes, or if there's more than one person in the photo, I need both people in focus. So, you know, again, this is a really good focal length for me to document things and tell stories. If I was shooting with a longer lens, maybe a 50, but definitely with an 85, like the picture of Chris Brown and Drake, that picture with an 85 would be much more dramatic, but wide open. There's no way both of their faces would be in focus unless I positioned them that way, which of course in a picture like this, I'm not given the opportunity or the luxury to do that. That's just a 2-second photograph. And the same thing with System of a Down backstage. They're just about to walk out, you know, and start a concert. I have them turn around, I take a picture. All 4 faces have to be in focus, but I still want that out of focus separation a little bit so that there's that pop and that, you know, that thing that makes it look like a really important photograph. Though that focal length will still do that at 2.8 instead of 2, and so that's usually where I'm shooting all the time.
It was actually going to be a question I was going to ask of our ambassadors. What's your go-to aperture?
Oh gosh,
That's a good question.
I'm usually at 5.6. I'd say 90% of the time, and if I'm not at 5.6, I'm at 7.1 or 8, just to try to I'm trying to get more in focus. So if I've got a pair of people I have to photograph, or if I've got a lot of movement, I've got a model or an actor that's moving around a lot, I'll go to 8 just so that I don't miss the focus. But usually 5.6 is about where I live.
Okay.
Yeah, for me, focusing on just my 21 millimeter, I'm usually about the same range, about f5, 5.6 at the least. And, you know, sometimes it can go as far as fully, you know, closed aperture of, I think, what is the f22. I don't like to always go that far. It's if I happen to be shooting something and I may have forgotten my filters and I'm trying to slow my shutter speed down enough. And I'll use the aperture to compensate for that. But I use for the variety, landscapes, street photography with the 21. I'm usually never wide open. I think it's very, very rare unless it's, you know, a foliage image and I might want that depth of field, but it's very rare.
So it leads maybe to my next question. So Aperture really does three things, right? It controls depth of field, which everyone here is kind of describing, right? You want to make sure that, you know, the subjects, particularly people, are in focus, so you have acceptable depth of field. Another one is kind of image quality, because the performance of a lens wide open is different than it is stop down, and I think it's a lot of thing that photographers have to get used to when they shoot a lens. And that kind of leads in the kind of the third and last kind of thing that people think about Aperture is control of exposure, right? It's kind of one of those key things with shutter speed and ISO. Obviously, Aperture controls the amount of light kind of going into the lens. So my question becomes, what's your exposure mode on your camera? What are you shooting?
I'm manual. I'm manual, and I you know, I'm usually, I'd say 90% of the time at an f/6, 1/165. And then I'm changing my ISO to control my light. So that image that Tony is popping up right now was a natural light photograph shot in like a garage door, 45-degree angle kind of situation. The carport right outside my studio, and it should be at 5.6 with that 1/165 shutter speed, and I've just controlled my ISO, and I think the only additional lighting I've got on that image is a reflector.
For me, I'm 99% aperture. The only time I'm in manual is if I'm photographing fireworks, if I'm doing long exposures where I'm in the bulb mode of my camera, or if I'm doing any kind of studio shooting and using, you know, any kind of lighting in that sense. Outside of that, usually always aperture priority. Reason being is because I'm always on the move, and the cameras are so smart these days that I don't mind the camera adjusting the shutter speed for me. I'm okay with that. You know, it's if we're going to want a lot of these features in our cameras, you know, I see a lot of times, oh, I might switch camera brands if this manufacturer doesn't put this kind of feature, that kind of feature in this camera. But then once they get it, they're still not even utilizing it. And so cameras are so smart. I don't mind it doing some of the autofocus or, you know, the auto ISO or exposure. You know, they're really, really good now to where I kind of trust my cameras.
And Greg?
I shoot in manual almost exclusively because I'm in situations where the light's always changing, and if you leave that up to the camera for either exposure or white balance or anything else, you're going to wind up with too much of a mess to deal with afterwards. And I'm usually the way I approach exposure now, because of especially the quality of the cameras, I start with the f-stop. That's what I choose first. I choose the f-stop that I want, and that's the f-stop that I'm going to shoot at, and I adjust everything else around that. The next thing I'll usually pick is shutter speed, which for me is always 100th of a second, because that works well for video and photos for me when I'm shooting, especially at 24p. And then ISO literally is the last thing that I choose, and I treat that as like a completely flexible, fluid,
So a spinning wheel.
Almost irrelevant number.
Right.
You know, that goes all the way back to the Sony A7S. I had one of those when that first came out, which the ISO literally doesn't matter on that camera, up to 50,000.
Yeah.
Every camera since then, all of the mirrorless cameras that have come out now have been so good in low light levels that I don't care about the ISO. I pick the shutter speed. I pick my f-stop first, my shutter speed relative to what I'm doing if I'm outside or if I'm shooting video, and then the ISO just falls where it needs to make those other two numbers work. I completely don't pay attention or care about my ISO.
That's really fascinating, because that option wasn't available to you a couple of years ago.
Right. No, ISO is another thing that you use to control the look of the photo. Like what most people do now in post-processing, because they want more contrast or a drastic color change or any of those other things, those are done now digitally in post-processing, but back in the film days, ISO was one of the ways that you accomplished that. If you wanted more grain or less contrast, or you process the film for longer, you push process, go beyond the ISO that it's rated for. Those were all things that, but that's all post-processing now. The ISO doesn't matter. I mean, I'm shooting with an A9. I shoot clean, no problem, 12,800, and don't think twice about it. That picture that I showed before of System of a Down backstage, that's ISO 12,000. You can't tell by looking at it. And I'm not using any funny noise suppression third-party software. It's an irrelevant setting on the camera to me now.
Yeah, I'm exactly the same way. I'm freewheeling with my ISO. I'm only changing my shutter speed if I need to change my ambient light. You know, if I feel like it's too bright and I need to stop it down, you know, that's the only time that I'm really changing my shutter speed. My my aperture, my f-stop only changes if I need to have more in focus. That's, you know, I'm living in one place and just changing my ISO as I'm moving around. So, and I'm a control freak, so it gives me more control.
Greg, there was a question that popped up, and you'd mentioned talking about video in your setup. Somebody had asked, Paul Giro asked, when you're doing video, are you shooting only in 24 frames, or are you doing anything with 60 frames per second or 120 FPS?
Shout out to Paul, great photographer, by the way. How are you? I shoot most of what I do at 24 frames per second so that I can take advantage of the 4K and try to get that cinematic look, et cetera, et cetera. I have done some stuff at 120p, which is pretty cool. We have that System of a Down video that was all shot.
Yeah, let me start that up here real quick.
This is something that my editor and I just, during quarantine, we got bored. I dug up some old footage, sent it to him. He put it to distorted live audio from my camera. And it's pretty awesome, actually. But it's all shot at 124 frames a second, and which is only 1080, by the way, on a Sony A9. That's not 4K. I got some comments, though, from other photographers when that came out. When I said, oh, it's shot on Sony A9, 120 frames a second, people were surprised that it still looks so crisp and so well defined, and there's such great separation in it, even though it's at only 1080. And not to sound like a sponsored statement, but that's that ZEISS look again. You know, it's like that's the added advantage that you get from using ZEISS optics, and why I've been using for so long, is that extra little level of quality, and not just resolution, but just the look to the photograph, so that even this System of a Down video that was only shot in HD still looks like anything that you've seen in 4K coming out of anybody else's cameras right now. And that's shooting stuff in crazy changing light and people that are moving and jumping around, and nothing is the same. It's, you know, that's some of that is the ZEISS look. I mean, the Sony A9 camera is great, but you put the ZEISS lenses on it and then you're in F1 mode.
I got a question for Rich on that. That was a good segue, because I have a question for that, and then I have a second question for the three of you. So Rich, can you like expand on that, as far as, you know, people see online a lot about the ZEISS look and you know, with certain images that are being shared online, but can you kind of expand a little bit on that, as far as what is the ZEISS look? How are we getting that specific kind of level of contrast and color that is, you know, really a very ZEISS thing? And I don't know, like what is a ZEISS look? I guess that's essentially my question.
So I'd like to say that making a lens is like it's like a three-legged stool, and you take away one of the legs and the stool doesn't stand up anymore. And it really comes down to the design. It's the quality of the materials, and it's how the lens is built. And each of them play an equal and important role in the quality of the lens. So in terms of the overall design, I mean, we've had the benefit that ZEISS has been making lenses going back over 125 years for camera lenses, longer for microscopes. So I would say that the optical and mechanical engineers really understand how light goes through glass, and they know how to control it. And when you think about what you're recording, whether or not it's still or video, it's made up of light rays, right? I mean, it's the light either emanates from a light source like a light bulb, or it's reflected off of the object. And it's tens of thousands of individual light rays that you're trying to record. And those light rays have to go pass through the lens to hit the image plane, whether or not you're shooting film or digital. The lens has to focus each of those light rays on the correct pixel point. And if that light ray isn't well controlled because it passes through the lens and it bends or ends up in a place on the sensor where it shouldn't be, you get an artifact, or in some cases you'll start to see loss of contrast and resolution. So the control of that light ray as it goes through the glass is part design, part the anti-reflective coatings, part the quality of the glass. The ability to keep light from bouncing around inside of the lens, so actually capturing that light ray and keeping reflections and ghosting to a minimum. That's all critical. So in the end, what a photographer will see, and I think what separates a ZEISS lens over our competition, is kind of sharpness. It's a three-dimensional pop in the image, and it's true colors, accurate colors. I would say the goal of the color rendition within the ZEISS lens families is to stay neutral, not to influence the color one way or the other, not to make it too warm and saturated and snappy, but to give the photographer and the filmmaker kind of a neutral palette to work with. And the three-dimensional pop or the micro contrast, I think, has always been attributed to a ZEISS lens going back to medium format days. Hasselblad, going back a long ways. And this is really the ability to separate detail into a distinctive subject, if you will. So if you're a landscape shooter and you're focused at infinity, I mean, your areas of broad contrast, right? Clouds against the sky, things like that. Any lens is going to record that and have a nice snappy image. But if you want to see details of leaves on a tree, when you're focused at infinity, the ability to separate the detail in those leaves instead of having just a blob of tone or something that doesn't have a lot of definition is micro contrast, right? That's the ability to maintain high contrast levels at that very fine detail. If you're doing, portrait or event photography, and I'm looking at Tracy and I'm looking at the fabric in the blouse that she has on. In a webcam, all I see is a tone. If she's going to shoot it with her Otus lens, she will see individual fibers in that fabric, and that separates, the crappy lens we see on the webcam from a lens that's going to resolve that high detail. So it's really those three things. I think it's the sharpness, the three-dimensional pop, and accurate colors.
I don't think I really understood that micro contrast, and thank you.
So we measure lens performance. So ZEISS invented modulation transfer function, or MTF, it's known by, as an objective way of measuring the performance of a lens without it mounted to a camera. All right. So this allows, it's almost like specs in baseball, right? It allows you to compare a modern player against an old player because you're playing by the same rule book. It's the same thing when we test lenses. We're using a piece of equipment that doesn't rely on camera technology. And we're measuring black and white line pairs, at 10, 20, and 40 line pairs, or cycles, if you will. And 10 line pairs is that area is kind of a broad contrast. And if you look at an MTF chart, it typically is the curve at the top of the chart. And then 20 line pairs is your areas of little finer detail. And 40 is going to be, again, that analogy I used before, is that texture in the fabric in a shirt, right? And the ability to separate that detail so it just doesn't become a continuous tone is, again, I think is what separates a ZEISS lens over another. And if you look at our MTF charts, we will show charts at wide open aperture, and the aperture that is the sweet spot of that lens, right? And typically, in an f1.4 lens, it's, typically it's f4. F2.8, it might be f5.6 is that sweet spot. If you stop that aperture down beyond it, you're not gaining sharpness or contrast. You might be gaining some depth of field, but you're not increasing the performance of the lens, or the optical performance of the lens. And then you reach a point, maybe f11, f16, where diffraction sets in, and then you start to lose performance. So I would say for like landscape shooters, if you're looking for great depth of field between your foreground and background, and you have the ability to do focus stacking, you're actually the focus stacking at like f4, you're going to have a much better image quality than if you stopped your lens down to f16.
That's very interesting. And it's one thing with the lenses, people see Zeiss Planar, Zeiss Biogon, or Tessar. With those different sort of lens constructions, do they play a factor in for any of the lens characteristics as far as what you're getting in the reproduction, or is it just key to that specific focal length as far as what lens design is utilized?
Yeah, so I think the lens families describe the characteristics of the lens, not the performance of the lens. So a planar is not better than a Biogon or a Distagon or anything like that. These are, the naming terminology goes back to the late 1800s when Zeiss first introduced the planar lens. We still have planar lens designs in the current lens family. The one lens I think that really put Zeiss on the map was the Tessar, which came out in 1892. We use the Tessar lens design in Nokia camera phones as an example. So that basic 4 lens element design is still it's still current, and it's really a testament to the optical designers back 100 years ago. They didn't have the benefit of computers. They had trial and error and experience. So as a tribute to their design, Zeiss gave these lens families these family names. So a planar lens typically is defined as a flat field lens. Macro planar would be a close focus flat field. A Biogon is a wide angle lens design that was originally done for rangefinder cameras with a very short flange focal distance. And Biogon, we still use Biogon lens designs in our M-mount lenses, because of the short flange distance. We use Biogons in for mirrorless some designs. A Distagon is another wide angle lens, but it's a retro focus style for cameras with mirror boxes. So all of these names give a characteristic or describe a characteristic of a lens family.
Okay, and so question that will go to Greg and Tracy and then come back to you, Rich, is that someone asked in the comments is from John Coop that asked, did you see a difference in the Milvus versus Otus? And knowing that both Tracy and Greg once used these lenses, like what were things that you all saw in using those two families? And then I want Rich to kind of, give a little bit of background about those two lenses and the different characteristics, because I mean, you're looking at a lens that ranges from, $45,000 to $5,000, where the Milvus line is about 15, sometimes 2,000 or so in that range. So what were some of the characteristics that you all saw in shooting those two? Start with Greg.
Well, the first thing is you can see the difference just looking through the viewfinder. I mean, you can. It's just the difference is it's obvious. I mean, it was obvious to me instantaneously, and so I don't know how to explain it exactly, but it's just like fast and faster. It's just Ferrari makes more than one car. There's one that's faster than the other, and there's one that's faster than that. I mean, it's just those lenses are really only for people who need and appreciate and can see and access the utmost level of quality from camera. It's like they're certainly wouldn't be recommended for everybody to use, but you can see the difference, and it's just every single thing that makes a Milvus lens great. If you're looking through an Otus lens, it's just greater. I mean, I'm sure Rich can explain it technically, but aesthetically, that's what it is. It's just a noticeable difference in everything, just more so, even more so than what you would like about the lens in that same focal length in the Milvus or Classic line.
So for me, when I started shooting with the Milvus, it was the realization that there was a Zeiss lens that was the same price point as the Nikkor that I had been shooting with. And so that really kind of took me into the Zeiss family, and it just was very, very sharp and very, very accurate and very, very color neutral. And then when I was introduced to the Otus lens the first time, it was, it's like you took this really almost perfect lens, but now you gave it more of a look and more of its own feel. And so the major difference for me is that smoothness, that graduation from sharp to non-sharp, the fall off area is just, it's so creamy and so smooth. And so the separation from my sharp to my non-sharp areas is just so very nice that I can shoot at 5.6. And on another lens, I would probably have to shoot wide open, but on an Otus, I don't have to do that. So I can hold more detail. I can have more of the fabric in detail. I can have more of the face in detail. I can hold both eyes in detail. And I love the range that I can go almost to black, but you can still pick out the fibers of a shirt, so that it doesn't completely disappear on me. There's detail in my darkest shadows, and there's detail in almost my brightest whites. And the range is just an incredible experience. Once I started shooting with the Otus, I think I told Tony he'd have to pry it out of my cold dead hands, because it was never leaving me. I just immediately fell in love with the quality of the lens. And Rich, maybe you can tell us why, again, that we see that, because I only know my response emotionally as a photographer.
So I can give you some background about why ZEISS decided to develop a lens line like this. And it really comes from the company's experience in the medium format world. Right. So I had I would say the fortune to work for Hasselblad before I joined ZEISS, and I was there during a significant transition from the use of medium format to 35 millimeter digital platforms, particularly in the wedding and event market, where there was a need to see an image, not just shoot on film and to see the proofs, a few days later, but actually to know that you had the shot, particularly at a wedding, where that was important. So that transition during that kind of early 2000s was pretty significant. When I started to work for ZEISS in 2006, there was some discussion about the development of, what do we do next? Because they were starting to build out the line of classic lenses and additional focal lengths, but we knew that digital cameras were there, full frame cameras were a factor that was not going to go away. And we also knew that because of ZEISS's relationship with Nokia, that sensors with very small pixel sizes was a reality in that area. And we knew that it was just a matter of time before that sensor technology continued to improve. And we saw, physically, the sensors not getting larger than 24 by 36, the same full format size, but we knew the pixel density would increase and the resolution would go up with it. So the one thing in a camera system is that lenses and cameras work in combination with each other. You can't use a lens on its own. You can't use a camera without a lens. They're designed to be part of a system. And the limiting factor in the system performance is the lens. Right? You can have a high resolution camera, and if you put a lens on the front of that camera that doesn't resolve the fine detail, you look at a A7R Mark IV with 61 plus megapixel. If you put in, you can adapt any lens to this camera, an old legacy lens with any adapter. If that lens doesn't resolve that fine detail, and that light ray as it passes through a lens isn't focused, it's focused, let's say, on not that 2 micron or I would say it's sub 4 micron pixel size, but instead that light ray spreads when it hits the sensor, and you're exposing groups of pixels. And then you start to see an overlap of lots of light rays, and you see loss of contrast, particularly at the edges. Long story short, in 2012, ZEISS started this project where they wanted to build the best possible camera lens they could build. And typically, the design goals, when we're developing a lens for the first time, it's always a balance, right? So we're always looking for that balance between performance and acceptable size, weight, and price. Because you can't have a lens that is too heavy, too big, too expensive, where there's no business behind it. So we had that part of that business where the classic lenses were designed with that balance in mind. A high performing lens that's not too big, too heavy, and was acceptably priced, versus the other choices that photographers had. The design goal with Otus, only build the best lens. Didn't matter how big, how heavy, how expensive. It was only with the technology and the materials and ZEISS's expertise, It was just build the best possible lens. And when the 55-1.4 was first introduced in 2014, people thought the company was crazy.
I bet it's like coming out with this expensive lens.
I mean, at the time we had the classic planar 1.450, which was a design from the Contax Yashica days. It really had not been changed in many, many years. It's a good legacy lens. It works pretty well at f4, f5.6 wide open. That's not so much. It's a nice portrait lens if you want to kind of hide a lot of details. But if you're looking for maximum detail at wide open, no, not so much. So the Otus lenses were designed for a customer that ZEISS used to have that shot ZEISS lenses on Hasselblad and Rollei cameras that have transitioned into full frame 35.
Like Greg is agreeing with that.
Like Greg.
I shot Hasselblad and shot film for 20 years, so that was my first exposure to ZEISS lenses and everything that they mean. And so yeah, when even from switching from film in Hasselblad to digital 35 millimeter back in 2005, yeah, that was weird and that was rough and that was strange. But then when the ZEISS classic lenses came out, it brought me back into it. So yeah, I understand that.
Yeah. So back in 2014, we had the classic planar 1.450, $725 was the list price. And then we brought out the Otus for $4,000. And it was a manual focus 55 millimeter 1.4, and people are going, who's going to buy this? And I remember at Photo Plus in 2014 when we had done a side-by-side print comparison against digital medium format systems on a Nikon D800. So we showed basically that a full frame 35 millimeter with the right lens on it would perform the same as a medium format system that was 30 grand, right? Because the Hassi H4D at the time was a $30,000 camera lens combination. So we compared it to a Leica S, we compared it to a Mamiya with a phase 1 back. We laid out these 11x17 prints and we said, pick one. And people picked the Otus with the Nikon. It was, and people said, okay, we get it. We understand that if you match the right lens with this camera, you're going to get the maximum potential out of the camera. Don't match that camera with the right lens, you're not seeing the full resolution that camera is capable of. And that's kind of the story behind why we did Otus.
And as opposed to like what you have in the Milvus, there are some trade-offs that you get in the Milvus, where you get really good image quality, but they're not as heavy as a Otus lens. It's there are a few compromises there, right?
Yeah, I mean you get the performance through a few different things. It's the design of the lens. Planar design is a relatively simple lens design. For the Otus 55, we decided to go with the Distagon, which traditionally had been used for wide-angle lenses, but it allowed a much more complex design with more lens elements that provided, because when you start to form an image with the first lens in a lens, every lens that comes after it corrects the light as it passes through the lens. That's the job of the last of these lens elements. The last lens element in that lens is correcting all of the light that has passed through the lens before it. So the Distagon style is a much more complex and allowed the lens designers to do a lot more elaborate design, right, to correct it. These lenses are also apochromatic, and ZEISS has, even the Hasselblad days, the 250 millimeter super achromat was a pretty revolutionary lens for film recording. So essentially, your white light, the light that passes through the lens, white light is not, there is no white light, right? White light is made up of the spectrum, the complete spectrum of lenses. And the sensors are recording red, green, and blue. And typically the green light, the wavelength of the red light is a little longer, and it focuses at a different point on the sensor than blue and green light. So most simple lenses will give you a little bit of color fringing because your red, green, and blue light is not focused on the same point on the sensor. An apochromatic lens will focus all of wavelengths on that single point on the sensor. And all of the The Otus lenses are apochromatic, which means you can shoot them at wide open aperture. There's no color fringing at all. You don't have to
Wow.
correct that in post. Now, correcting a single image in Lightroom or any of the other post programs for a single image, okay, it's doable. If you're shooting video like Greg's doing, you can't correct for chromatic aberration. So
Right.
you're shooting way too many frames. So we use an apochromatic design not just in the 4 Otus lenses, but also in the 135 Milvus and the Otus 135. So when we have the ability, these are really beautiful lenses.
And with all of that, another aspect with great lenses also comes with the coating of those lenses too, and that's something that is very revolutionary with the ZEISS lenses and the T-Star coating.
Mm-hmm.
How does that play a factor in the image quality as well in terms of coating, as well as like the new coating that came with the ZEISS Supreme Radiance lenses? That's the T-Star blue coating. What does the coatings provide for your overall image reproduction, what you're getting?
So a multi-coated lens is designed to prevent the reflection of that wavelength off the lens surface. So a piece of uncoated glass, like window pane glass, will reflect up to 4% of the light that hits that glass on both surfaces, both the front and the rear. And you look at a lot of complex lenses that have up to 17 lens elements. If you have that amount of light loss on all of those lens surfaces, you have very little light that's actually transmitted through the lens. And a coated lens will prevent that light from being reflected off the surface and keeps the light being transmitted through the lens to its intended target on the sensor. So ZEISS invented anti-reflective coating initially for binoculars in the mid-30s, and then ultimately, 3-lens coating in the late 30s, and then multi-coated lenses in the 70s. And these multi-coated are up to 9 different layers on a lens, and they're deposited in a vacuum chamber. So essentially, they vaporize metals, and they're deposited evenly on the lens surface. So, and the benefit to the photographer is that you have a reduction in stray light and ghosting, and you're able to maintain the color consistency between focal lengths. You referenced the Supreme Prime Radiance. These are motion picture lenses where we actually went in and deliberately allowed a little bit of blue light to pass through and to reflect off the interior lenses. So we call these selective flare, because with the Fresnel light going through the lens, what you'll see is a little bit of a blue ghost trail. You take away that Fresnel light and you have a diffuse light source in your frame, and you see no reflections at all. So ZEISS was able actually to tweak the anti-reflective coating to deliberately allow a little bit of this blue reflection.
And I would say I'll just pop in here a minute to let the audience know that the things that Rich is talking about, there's rather an in-depth vlog, as it were, on our YouTube page. If you look up Snehal Patel, he's talking about creating flares, and it really goes in depth about why, how we actually coordinate the flares and what this T-Star Blue does in the Radiance lenses.
So we have a question too from Paul, and he wants to know how do you determine the exact amount of focus throw in the Otus lenses? I'm having trouble reading this. Are they like the cinema lenses in that they stay the same from lens to lens in the line?
They don't. They don't. A cinema lens barrel is typically all the same dimension. Where the still photo lenses, the barrel dimensions all vary. So what they try to do is to make the most compact lens that they can make for that given focal length, but still have the maximum amount of focus throw. So the focus rotation in the Otus and the Milvus line are going to vary a little bit. Typically, your wide-angle lenses don't require the same amount of focus rotation because the focus range from close focus to infinity is fairly short. Your longer lenses typically have a longer throw. They're able to have consistent focus throw on cinema lenses because of just the mechanical design of the barrel.
Okay. There's a question that came in earlier, and this will go to both, I guess all of us really, because we use the 40mm close focus. Have any of you utilized the 40mm with the close focus capability for the work that you do. So not as your typical standard lens, but also taking advantage of that close focusing capability of the lens.
I
It's
use it
my
whenever it's appropriate. I mean, if I'm doing a close-up shot of, music gear, detail shot of a guitar, drumsticks, or I mean, yeah, I take advantage of what it's capable of doing. Sure, it's really really good. I don't use it in the autofocus mode. I've found that autofocus for really close-up photography is kind of not a waste of time, but generally, I know Rich is the same way about this because he loves to shoot his 35-1.4 at 1.4. If you're going to shoot up close of things like parts of cars or, again, details of a guitar or something like that, you are going to want to choose exactly where that plane of focus is. And typically, if you leave that up to autofocus, it's just going to be wandering all over and not going to pick the aesthetic choice. So, but yeah, I'll push that lens all the way to minimum focus as close as possible, wide open, put my focus point exactly on whatever I want to be razor sharp, and then everything else disappears. It's wonderful.
It's been a lot of fun to shoot with. It's been my pandemic lens of choice. So I have been posting a lot of images from my Sony with the 40 Otus, and using the close focus because it's just, for me, it's been a time of experimenting because it's not what I normally get to shoot. So I've been able to really experiment with it a lot. But I am similar to what Greg was saying. I'm not using autofocus completely. I'm using direct manual focus, which allows me to autofocus and then adjust manually to what I want exactly in focus.
And then for me, I've used it for a variety of things. When I'm doing weddings or taking pictures of people's rings, I've actually gone to using the close focus as opposed to my classic 50 macro lens. I think that the close focus does me just fine for images like that. I also utilize it for if I'm doing any kind of foliage images, and I just it's very great quality, and just like Tracy and Greg, same thing. I'm manual when I'm doing that close focusing capability of the lens. Something we didn't touch on also is that me shooting with the Loxia lenses, Rich, what is sort of kind of like the specialties of a Loxia lens? Because I think that's a line that a lot of people really don't know about or even know that it's out there, as opposed to the Otus lenses, which are more popular. They're autofocusing lenses. But in comparison to a Otus, what about Loxia? Where do those fit in, and what's so special about a Loxia lens?
I think that these were designed for both still and video applications, because Sony is using the E-mount for both APS-C and full frame sensors, and like the Sony FS5s and FS7s, there are a lot of these cameras out in the marketplace worldwide that we saw an opportunity to develop a line of manual focus lenses that a filmmaker can pull focus with. Instead of trying to manually focus a lens that was designed for autofocus, where you don't have hard stops on your close focus and infinity, you don't have a manual aperture that you can declick, and where the focus rotation is relatively short from close focus to infinity, where you don't have a lot of control. That's one of the applications the Loxias were designed for, and the other was still photo, and two applications there. One, much like you were saying you were shooting the landscape in Tennessee. The Sony with the Loxia 21 for backpacking applications, can't beat it. Just
oh my gosh, you really can't.
small, it's light, it's a perfect match to the camera. And the other one is street photography, for particularly the 35 and the 50. If you want to go out and zone focus and just shoot on the street, you have an acceptable. If you stop that lens down, and the nice thing with ZEISS lenses is we provide depth of field marks on the lenses, so that you can go out and you can preset your focus to maybe 10 or 12 feet, stop down to f8, what your acceptable range of focus is, and you just go out and respond to what you see on the street without having to worry whether or not your lens is going to autofocus correctly on the subject you're shooting.
Oh, absolutely. And since I've kind of gravitated to that whole manual RAM, kind of, going in the footsteps of all three of you here, and being such avid lovers of the manual lenses, you know, I absolutely love the Loxias, and having those stops is very useful for me
Hmm.
because a lot of people assume that in my street work, I'm photographing those wide open, and I'm not. I'm actually stopping the lens down, you know, 5.6 or f8, and capturing my images that people's walking into a shot, or, you know, if I'm just gauging distance, if I see someone that's, you know, maybe 5 feet in front of me, I can actually set that on my lens and know exactly what I'm going to obtain, and know that I
Hmm.
got that shot.
Right.
So I have a question for you, Rich. So most of you don't know that Rich, I mean, you meet him at the trade shows and you know that he is our wealth of knowledge, but you don't know that he's an excellent photographer. He's really, really very good. So you mentioned early on in the beginning of our program that you shoot wide open. So why do you choose to shoot wide open? None of us do, so it's so different than what we do. So
Because I don't shoot people.
That's a very, I
very
mean, that's
good answer.
because, I mean,
Agree.
if I'm doing street with the 85, I'm usually wide open on the Bodice 85, but
Right.
for everything else, yep.
All my subjects are static. Um, I mean, I go back and look at pretty much everything I've ever shot, and it's devoid of people. It's just I just choose to shoot different subjects. So it gives me the flexibility and the option of shooting wide open, and to really play with the focus fall off in both the foreground and background, and it gives me a chance to highlight details in the scene that often are overlooked. So that's kind of what I gravitate to it. But maybe a question I can ask of you guys: do you miss using a Zoom?
Ooh.
No, for me, no, because I was using a Prime already when I came to ZEISS. So I have a I have a very expensive 70 to 200 $2,400 lens that's been in a drawer for 4 years.
For me, I definitely can say I have not. I was hesitant on the wide side because I had the Sony Zeiss 16 to 35 lens. I actually still own it, but then I got the 21 millimeter Loxia. I actually have not touched my 16 to 35 in, I want to say, maybe 3 to 4 months. I've actually been mostly using the 21. It might not be as wide as, if there's ever a situation where I really, really have to get wider than 21, I will use the 16 to 35 just for the 16. I'm not using it throughout that range. But
Okay.
I've mostly, like Tracy, I've pretty much mostly been prime lenses because I want that better image quality, and you know, the prime lenses are just where I'm going to obtain that from.
Mm.
So I've not missed it at all. I used to have the 24 to 70 Sony Zeiss, but as Zeiss started coming out and filling in the Bodice line, I would sell whatever, you know, lenses that I had that were the Sony Zeiss variant to get the Zeiss only, and you know, I've not missed it.
Right, you, Greg?
I'll still use them in situations where I am where I have no control whatsoever, where I have no control over where I can stand, how long I can shoot, what's going on. Maybe it's live television, so there's only one take. There aren't other opportunities for me to get things, and I have to get everything that I need from one place. Then yeah, I'll use a zoom lens, but only for that reason. A feature that a lot of people probably don't know about, though Rich was the one that showed me about it, on all the Sony mirrorless cameras, there's a 2x zoom feature on there,
Right.
which for video, which is incredible, and there's absolutely no quality loss. And so, because of that, what it does, and there's no exposure loss, there's nothing. So if I'm using the Bodice 40 and shooting video, I can engage that, and all of a sudden, I now have a 40 to 80 f2 Bodice zoom lens technically on my camera,
Yeah.
which gives me a tremendous amount of versatility and makes it almost unnecessary for me to need to use a longer focal length. That being said, also with the quality of cameras and the lenses that we all use, I don't know about you guys, but I'll admit this. I know some people are like, "Oh no, you can't crop your frame." I'll crop my frame to 50% or even 33% and not even think about it,
Mm.
and no one can tell. if I'm using a 40 millimeter lens and there's something that happens like, oh, gee, that would be great to shoot with an 85. Yeah, well, that's not going to happen. I'll just center my subject and then crop it to an 85 or a 100 millimeter, not perspective, all right, and not anything else, but the same crop that lens would give me. And you can't tell the difference. And I get away with that all the time.
Right, right.
Hey,
Yeah,
Tony, do you
Tony,
have that picture of that little boy that I did? I don't know if you could pop that up.
Sure
That's
thing.
exactly the concept that Greg is talking about. I just, after I took that shot,
Oh,
I
okay.
loved
Yep.
the freckles and the eyes on this kid, and I cropped the hell out of it. And you can see, as cropped as this is still there's no loss of detail at all. But I just really loved this kid full on in the image. I didn't want the rest of the image.
There's way more, I think, in my opinion, I think most photographers nowadays are leaving way too much quality on the table and not taking fully advantage of what their gear can do. I mean, I've had billboards in Times Square shot on an A7S. That's a 12 megapixel camera. Okay, so do you know what I'm saying? You can get away with a lot more than you think you can if you're really using your gear and setting it up the right way and using it all at the highest level. People should take more advantage of that. That you can save yourself sometimes that way.
Mm.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I wanted to mention this just so for video record, Tony had mentioned the clear image zoom. That's the feature that Greg was
Right.
talking about in the Sony cameras. So
Yeah,
Tony actually got on that in the comments before I was like, okay, he's on it.
And it works on the Loxia also.
yeah, find that in your menu and utilize it. It's a great underutilized feature. It's a game changer, really.
Mhm.
It means that you've always got a zoom lens on your camera at all times.
Right.
Oh,
Good
yeah.
point. Good point.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're getting to about an hour, everybody. I just wanted to see if you had any closing thoughts or any last comments that we wanted to make before we wrap this up.
I have some. I'd like to volunteer myself or anybody else if you guys want to. If there are any students or teachers that are watching this, if you'd like me to do a Zoom conference or teach a class over Zoom or whatever all else to any or some of your students, I would be happy to do that. Please just hit me up. My website or anywhere else, Instagram. I would love to do that. I've already done a couple now, and I'm happy to speak to people that are all locked in and share knowledge.
I think that's what this is all about. That's why we started this whole series, is so that we could start sharing. And I appreciate all of you guys being here for this and helping us do this. And I'm with Greg, absolutely. I actually just got an invitation I told Tony this. I just got an invitation to speak to my alma mater in the fall, and I'm very, very excited about it. They want me to come speak on executive portraits and editorial portraits. So if you need me, reach out. I think all of us are there.
Oh, absolutely. And we certainly appreciate Rich and sharing his wealth of knowledge, because I mean, this is what I love
Thanks.
about this guy. he's always got the information there for us, and there's a lot that you can't really find online as far as different things about the lenses, and just to pick his brain. That's how come I really love being with ZEISS. It's just to mess with Rich and find out what information he have to share with me.
All you have to do is ask.
Yeah, that's it.
Right.
And maybe my final part. I see a question here from DB that he's looking to travel to Scotland and Lake District in this autumn and using Otus on his GFX 100. Do I need to worry too much about weather resistance? You have to be careful. Unlike the Milvus and the Otus lenses, the Otus series is not weather sealed, weather or dust resistant. So I think you just need to take normal precautions. It's likely to be a little bit of moisture, I think, in that part, a little bit on the cool side. I would not use the lenses in any sort of misting or rainy condition unless you're going to protect them. So that would be my reply to your question.
That was a good question to definitely round out everything with.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate you being on with us. As always, my sincere appreciation to our ZEISS ambassadors, as well as Rich this time, Greg Watermann, Tracy Page, Kenneth Hines, and of course, Rich Schleuning from ZEISS. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. We had a really great conversation. Join us again on Friday at 3 p.m. We're going to talk about food photography and how to, with a couple of photographers that are really good on that, and more to come. So we'll see you then, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye.